Welcome back to Society Case Files. My name is Robert, and today is Friday Ramble. I'm going to grab a couple of topics I've been thinking about and just chat about them. If you like this kind of content and you want to see more, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Otherwise, I'm going to dive right in. The first topic we are going to discuss is that sense of peril that we received from old MMOs specifically. I know that there's a lot of games these days that do present a sense of dread or consequence for things that happen, specifically games like the Elden Ring and Souls-like games. You know, those are pretty punishing for mistakes and messing up. But back in the day, MMOs held a special place for that since we didn't have any kind of save function. It was kind of new when they first started to not be able to save your game, to have the potential of losing a lot of time and content. Now, we can go way back to games that didn't have saves and stuff, products that you basically only had a single save. You know, there was a time that gaming was pretty rough. But around the time that Ultima Online came out, many games that we might play that were single player at least had some save function that we could get into and ensure that we didn't waste a lot of time. But once Ultima Online started, there was no player versus player toggle. It was just worldwide. You could just get annihilated and lose all of your stuff. And the further away from town you got, the more of this sense of dread you'd receive, where you'd be like, oh my goodness, I'm totally going to get killed. And if it happens, then, you know, I might lose everything, depending on what took you out. If it was just an NPC, then you had a chance of finding your stuff. If not, you're kind of in trouble. And I always remember that sense, that feeling in the gut that you're going to find something out there that you might not be able to handle, whether it's another player or a freaking dragon. It didn't matter. And it was kind of cool. But at the same time, I don't know if the excitement was worth it. Like, thinking back, it was neat. It was like, oh, we're doing something really terrifying. But ultimately, if the bad thing happened to confirm your fear, it was mostly just a practice in frustration and irritation, as you had to either get your stuff back or in some cases start from scratch to remake what you lost, whether it was money or gear or whatever. And EverQuest, the first one, was actually pretty bad about this too. It was to the point where you'd lose experience, you could lose your stuff, not necessarily to another player, but if you couldn't find your body or you couldn't get back to it, it was pretty bad. And it was such an issue that you would generally set up a macro so that when you died, you could hit a button to show you the location of where you died so that you could get back to those coordinates. And what was funny is that there's also, I'm sure if you've played EverQuest 1, you probably saw this. I don't know if they still do it. I know the game's still out, but you'd have to go out to your body, and then, like, if there were a bunch of monsters there, you'd try to drag it away. So you'd be hitting a macro to drag your body away from the danger just so you could grab the stuff off of it. And sometimes you'd have to die a second time just to make sure that you cleared that aggro and then be able to pick up all of your things. And of course, at the same time, you're losing experience and could lose levels as a result. I once lost 2 levels because I made the mistake of just not logging out of the game. I went and stood basically near the exit of a zone, and it was where I was spawning anyway. So I died. A monster came along and killed me. I respawned. The same monster killed me again, and it happened enough times to make me lose a level, all because I was on dial-up. I didn't want to lose the good connection I had. I needed to do something away from the computer. I didn't hear any of the chaos going on. And so I just basically lost a ton of stuff. It was absolutely nuts. Now, back then, you know, I was actually in college and I could multitask in a way that I could put my EverQuest screen at the top of my monitor and do homework and stuff below that. And I was playing a cleric, so I could go hang out with a party and heal them and just soak up XP for any number of hours I wanted. So it wasn't that big of a deal to me then. But I'll tell you, if I lost a bunch of levels now, I'd just be like, I don't care anymore. There's other things to do. And I think it's kind of funny because the mentality has dramatically shifted. World of Warcraft, when it first came out, there wasn't really much peril. There were hardly any ramifications for dying other than having to go back to be resurrected at your body. You didn't even have to pick up your stuff. You just had to get there. And yet it was still annoying and frustrating, but it didn't have that punishment that EverQuest 1 did, where you were like, you could be done. You could lose a lot from dying. But what was interesting was that there was still a sense of peril, despite the fact that the death penalties weren't really that bad. It still sucked. And so going into a dungeon for the first time, like Shalomance, you and maybe your buddies or maybe people you don't know, heading into that dungeon for maybe the first time or just sneaking around it, and you'd see the monster over there, you're like, ooh, don't mess with that thing. It's probably going to take us out in 2 or 3 hits. That was some actually fun gameplay. I enjoyed it. I liked having that moment of, ooh, we got to be careful. And that's really what it came down to, is as long as you were careful, that peril was fun. But if you made a mistake and you couldn't escape or something happened, then it stopped being fun pretty fast, because again, you're back to the inconvenience stuff. Of course, as we go on with MMOs, the penalties, the punishment for failure became less and less. And it actually turned more from the internal system punishing you by taking experience or gear or whatever. And it sort of became more of a toxic community penalty. So if you make a mistake, then the people you're playing with become angry, or, you know, you get some really cruel things said to you while you're trying to play the game. So I much prefer the system to punish me than to have to worry about a bunch of players being jerks because we made some kind of error, whether it's because we were playing a tank and we made a mistake, or the healer didn't get somebody, you know, saved at the last second, or whatever it might be. It's kind of crappy that it turns into a freaking code red where you're being punished by the player base. It really does come down to, sometimes you have great parties that are super nice and they're like, hey, it's no big deal. Let's just pick ourselves up and we'll figure it out. Or they might even offer advice and say, hey, I totally see what you did there, and here's the mistake. But just as often, you run into people that either rage quit or they go off on you, and you end up suffering some sort of social ramification, and that kind of sucks. But that peril really is gone. I mean, even now, there's no place that I really dread to go in World of Warcraft, with level scaling so prevalent since Guild Wars 2 on. Games just scale. So there's not really any peril in games. It's hard to find a place that you're going to go in an MMO that isn't scaled in such a way that you can survive some kind of encounter. Now, you might not be able to do the dungeons, of course, or the raids, that kind of thing, because you do need to level up your gear. But just open world, just exploring, there's no fear to that anymore. And that's true of Elder Scrolls Online. Once they did level scaling, you could literally do any zone you wanted right off the bat. You could just pick it. You're like, that one sounds kind of fun. And you're doing top level content at level 10. And it's scaled in such a way that your crappy white gear is no problem. You're just tearing through it. And in a way, that's kind of frustrating, because once we get into level scaling specifically, it starts to take away a sense of accomplishment, because there's never a time that you're just owning things. You never feel like you progressed beyond whatever it was you started with. Or in some cases, you are tearing it up no matter where you go, and you always feel overpowered, except for in the group content, dungeons, raids, etc. Now, because of that and that scaling and that peril being removed, there's not as much on the line when you go out and check things out. You could just decide, hey, that looks neat, I'm going to go look at it. There's no, ooh, I should prepare. I need to go get some healing potions. I need to ensure that I've got my gold in the bank so that if I do die, I'm going to lose it. I don't want to lose anything. So I'm going to put as much of my things that I don't need into the bank. And then I'm just going to go there with the bare bones and check it out and see if it's safe. Now, there are other places you could get this. You could get them in the survival games like Ark or Conan Exiles or whatever. Those games might still have some of it. But as far as the big MMOs, make a character, have a proper skill tree, PvP stuff going on, it just seems to be gone. But let me know what you think. Are there games that you still feel a sense of peril when you play them? Are there any games that you like to experience that potential of punishment that might take something from you that you have committed to the game, that slight gamble that just gives it meaning? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. All right, moving on to the next topic. I want to discuss shows and games and movies that do something that really betrays the character that you have been following. It might even be more than one character, where you've been watching this thing or you've been engaging in this material, and then at the end, the people who have created it have put you in a position to where you feel like it's just been for nothing. Or maybe they just missed the landing so hard that it was just a total betrayal. But let's take it a step back from the holistic plot being a problem, and let's discuss characters specifically. So I'm watching the show called The Practice. There's 8 seasons of it. The first 7 seasons follow this group of characters, and then at the end of the 7th season, they were running low on the ratings. They were going to pretty much cancel the show. In fact, many people thought it was. And then at the last minute, it got picked up, providing that they cut the budget considerably. So they let go a whole bunch of the actors and then moved into the 8th season with 2 characters that were pretty much in every episode of the entire show. And then another guy who had been in quite a few. And then they introduced James Spader's character, who effectively was brought in to tear the show down. Now, this show came out in 2003, 2004. So if you haven't seen it and you really do intend to, I am going to introduce some spoilers here. But I kind of feel like it's been 20 years since it was out. And that just sounds terrible. I didn't see it when it first came out, so I don't feel quite so dusty. But if you do want to watch it and you need to be spoiler free, you might want to fast forward ahead here. There are timestamps so you can skip to the next section. But with The Practice, they effectively brought in a new character, and he was sort of designed to tear the show down, to burn it down, to finish it in this really strange way. And I think that's really interesting. Now, I didn't find any specific things from the people who created the show to suggest that, but I have read multiple articles of people saying that that was the intention. And what's kind of crappy about it is that the 2 main characters in the show that are holdout or leftover from the previous seasons, they get severely marginalized in the last season of this show. And they're just almost there to be foils of this character who just comes in out of the blue. And I would think that had I watched the show from when it first began, when we started the show in 1997, and I watched it all the way through to the 2004 conclusion, I would imagine I'd be pretty upset to see characters that I had been experiencing for the better part of 7 years. And I mean, obviously it's not on every single day. It's not a soap opera, but still I had to wait for it back then. You know, I'm watching through the show. We finished the season. I'm right there for the next one. If I was that type of person and I got to season 8, I'd be pretty mad. Now, I had watched Boston Legal prior to watching The Practice. So I already sort of had an affinity for the character that they introduced into The Practice. But as I watched The Practice, much as I love him, I love the actor, and I love the character, it is just overall crap what they do to those people that had been in the show the whole time. It is just not the kindest send-off for all that they have endured. It's also crappy that they didn't just allow these 2 people to carry the show as the leads. Instead of being the leads, they sort of take back seat to this new guy who hadn't even been in a cameo before. He's literally a brand new character, just sort of shoot in. I would imagine that it should have been pretty frustrating. Some people online I saw were saying it was a breath of fresh air. Other people said it was total garbage and they hated it. So it really did polarize, I guess. I don't know what it was like back then. I didn't pay attention to shows back in 2004 very much. I didn't see it in its first run. I didn't see Boston Legal in its first run. In fact, I started watching Boston Legal this year on Hulu. And I think it's very strange to see a show do that to the characters. And what's even more odd is that it's clear the creators just didn't care what people thought. They didn't care if people were angry that some of their favorite characters were trashed, because they just did it anyway. And they also do a lot of other strange things with those shows that I could probably talk about in another segment, specifically with how they write characters out of the show. They're just gone. That's it. They're there for a little bit and then they're just gone. No send off, no explanation, not even a single line of dialogue to explain what happened to them. That's it. And I don't know. I'm not a big fan of that at all. I think that the strength of those particular shows comes from some of the wittiness that goes on, and a few of the cases are pretty interesting. They do at least focus on the law for the most part, but by and large, I think that by the end, you would feel pretty upset about the main characters getting marginalized, and that happens quite often in shows where maybe the writer doesn't really care for that character anymore, or for whatever reason, they decide that the person who is left over from other people leaving is just not up to the task of running with the show as the lead. There's a character in MI5, the first season basically sees Matthew McFadden is the lead in the show. And there was an episode in that early on where his character gets completely screwed over. And shortly after that, the actor left the show. And then shortly after that, a second lead actor leaves the show. And that left the final actor. And from what I've read, he was pretty much told that he couldn't carry the show because he was black. And they had a lot of allegations of racism stuff. And they treated his character absolutely terribly. And I will admit that I did watch that through, and I thought it was total crap what they did to him. He was awesome. I think he would have done a great job. I think they were just cowards for not letting him have the reins of that show, and they should have seen what happened. But instead, they just brought in some other dude and marginalized him and got rid of him. And it is strange how often this happens. Now, that show didn't last as long before it started marginalizing people, but it still happened, and it's still super frustrating. It's really bad when you're watching a show and whatever main character you happen to like becomes like somebody you would never imagine. And even the actors are like, why was I doing that? What was the character doing that for? If you're just generating drama, there are other ways to do it. More believable ways to do it specifically. There's a lot of shows that do it. Games do it too, where you're playing along and all of a sudden something happens to either your main character or characters in the story that kind of ruin it. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, when you're playing through the game, there's a character that you're sort of representing who's in the modern day, and they get completely hosed over by basically Loki, and they don't really exist anymore at the end of that episode, as far as I could tell. And that was just weird. I mean, you'd had that character for multiple games and really explored the modern world with them, and then all of a sudden they're just screwed over and done. That's it. And for video games, it especially feels weird because as the person controlling the fate of that character on so many levels, whether it's through combat or choices on how you're going to upgrade their gear and that kind of thing, it's always really strange when the story pigeonholes your character in a way that just doesn't even make sense based on how you've been playing them or how you've governed their new powers and stuff. So like there's this role-playing game, and then the narrative pushes them into a direction that makes no sense because they only had one story. It's not like that in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, where there are choices and your choices matter and can shape the outcome of one of the multiple endings. Some of these games like Assassin's Creed don't have multiple endings. They have one ending, and how you get there is kind of up to you, but ultimately you're going to get there. It's going to happen the way they want, and regardless of the things you've done, it's pretty much going to be one way. So, it's really hard to get excited about those games when that happens. And it's kind of carries the same feeling that I get in a game that when I'm watching a show or a movie and the character gets hosed like that. I don't want to go into too much depth about The Last Jedi, but I know that a lot of people are pretty unhappy about how Luke came out. Then there's another video game. I will bring it up. It's one of the MechWarrior games. So this is pretty cool, very inspired by Dune plotline, where you are a young nobleman. You were out hanging out with basically a group of mercenaries, and your home planet gets attacked and your family gets either killed or some of them are abducted. So you show back up on the planet and you conduct a guerrilla war to reclaim your home. And it's a really fun game, especially back then. It just worked on every level for me. But at the end of the game, when you're all successful, everything's good, they announced that they're going to make an expansion that carries on. It's like, okay, cool. I mean, what exactly am I going to do with this character now? He's already gone through quite a lot. So I get the expansion, and instead of playing the character you just did, now you're like some other mercenary guy, and your previous character that you played has become a tyrant, and you have to go through and kill all of the people that you just worked with. So that is marginalized on a whole new level now, because not only did you basically lose out on the opportunity to advance their story in a meaningful way, but the previous story turned out so awful that new people had to come in and kill the characters that you were playing. This has happened plenty of times before, where your main character becomes the bad guy in the next game, but it's just kind of amazing. That was one of the first times that I was utterly frustrated. In fact, as soon as I sort of figured out what was happening, I lost interest in the expansion and quit playing it, because I was not going to go through and trash everything I had just built in the previous game. That just wasn't happening. Maybe I hadn't spent enough time apart and I could have looked at that narrative and thought, hey, this is actually kind of cool. I sincerely doubt it, because I really despise that sort of thing. Another example of something that just didn't land very well is the Mass Effect series. The first two games are just brilliant, especially in the second one, where you've got the suicide mission, and if you do certain things, you can ensure that everybody survives. That's really cool. And I mean, I was so into that I played the game multiple times to ensure that I found a new way to do it, to make sure that I got everybody through okay. And then in the third game, some of it didn't even seem like it mattered anymore, and that was really frustrating, especially since we had done such a great job in the previous two entries of giving you choice and giving you autonomy to make choices, that by the time the end came, there really wasn't a choice. There wasn't really multiple endings. It was just, a different sort of voiceover after what you did. And that was pretty frustrating too. I think your character got dramatically marginalized in that one. And I know that it caused some pretty severe outcry from the fans, enough that, it got absolutely ridiculous, in fact. So all around, I think it's very interesting how often writers and creators will marginalize characters and not really seem to care about the consequences of doing so. It's not like they really are worrying about whether or not people even like what they've done. And I don't really understand how they've gotten to that point. How is it that you, as a creator who clearly must love the kinds of work that you're doing, you like this stuff, otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. You like fantasy adventure, you like law shows, whatever. And yet somehow you think it's okay to end something in this way, or to marginalize a character that everyone loves. And it's almost feels punitive in a way. It's like, how dare you like the character I didn't enjoy writing, or something. I don't know. But I'd be curious to hear your opinion. What do you think it comes down to when a character becomes so blatantly marginalized or changes dramatically from the initial concept? Do you like it? Do you think it's cool? Do you think it should happen? Do you even have a theory about why it might? I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment and we'll talk about it. Let's move on to the last topic. It's going to be video game movies. This is a great topic because it is just insane how bad most video game movies come out. I mean, everyone's got a story about how terrible whatever game is. And it could be one they were super excited about. It could be anything. I have watched a lot of video game movies, but I think that nobody on the planet has done more to make video game movies suck than Uwe Boll. You know, with his House of the Dead, Blood Rain, Alone in the Dark, Far Cry. I can't remember if he did any more than that. But whatever he did do, he made sure to just absolutely wreck the opportunity for future game movies. I mean, they sort of find themselves in a bad place because of his efforts. Specifically, if you think back to House of the Dead, if you had the misfortune of seeing that movie, there are some things in that make zero sense. Like, there was no reason for them to be so bad. I'm thinking of the scene where they've got to fight their way to the house, and for whatever reason, he does like this 360-degree view of each character. Sometimes they're not wearing the same clothes they were in the previous scene. Sometimes they're using different weapons than they actually had. It was absurd. I mean, the movie was terrible top to bottom. Alone in the Dark, the most memorable thing about it is the ridiculous amount of exposition he puts on the screen at the very beginning just to explain his foolishness. Never mind how bad the movie is after that. I forgot another one, Dungeon Siege. Yeah, he did that too. Which actually is the least bad of all of them, in my opinion. Now, that's not to say much. It's just that it was vaguely amusing, especially since ninjas just show up out of nowhere in the fantasy world. But I think that his primary problem was that I don't think he cared. And what's funny is he gets really indignant about people trash talking him, like saying things like, you just don't appreciate the fact that I've brought this to the screen for you. Hey, I even thought of another one, Going Postal. God, I wish I didn't know so many Uwe Boll movies. This sucks. But anyway, his movies were freaking terrible. They just clearly are made as like tax write-offs or something. It was amazing. But then you get real attempts, and some that even get some decent reviews or do well. You know, Tomb Raider, that was an okay movie. I think they did their best. The second one was perhaps not as good as some people thought. You get the more modern one that tried to take a page from the re-released video games, or the reboot games. And that one didn't make sense as to why it wasn't better. Like, they had a great story, but part of the problem is that the story of the reboot Tomb Raider takes like 7 to 10 hours to finish. So you can't really cram that down into 2 hours. Now, if you trim out all of the mistakes and all of the times you die, you still got a 3 or 4 hour story, and it's still going to be too long to cram into a movie. So even perfecting all the jumps and ensuring that you make it through all the peril, you're going to find yourself with a longer story than your average movie can be. In a way that some of these should probably be television shows, like the Castlevania animation, where they actually make 3 seasons to really capture that story out. But it's not fair to really talk about animation here, because animated movies tend to be better received when it comes to video games than live action movies. Moving on to another example is the Assassin's Creed movie. I remember enjoying it when I saw it in the theater, as in I thought it was fun, but I can't remember much about it other than the people in it at this point. I know that the Animus was completely insane and looked nothing like the game. I know that the past stuff was in Spain, and that Michael Fassbender was in it, and that's about it. I also know that he was really into the idea of making the movie, which is cool. I do prefer when the person who is in the movie is really excited about it. That's neat. But it was a forgettable one. The Hitman movie with Timothy Olyphant. I like that movie. For me, it's pretty much just any other assassin movie. I've seen a lot of them. They're not exactly high art, and I think the Hitman movie follows along closely enough to where it shouldn't have been crapped on that much. Now, does it have much to do with the Hitman games? Maybe the older ones. The new ones are kind of puzzle games as opposed to what they used to be. So, I don't know. I think that it was a reasonable representation. The game itself is pretty ridiculous. I'm not saying it's bad. I love the Hitman games, but I mean, they are ridiculous. And so I think that they captured those fairly well, but they didn't get well received, either of them, for that matter. And it just goes on and on. You just keep thinking of video game movies. Resident Evil, that got actually, 7 films? They are fun. I went and saw them in the theater first day. I liked them all. I mean, they don't have much to do with the game itself, but I think that as far as like an interpretation goes, I think they captured the feel fairly well, and I thought they were sufficiently actiony. And I think that's part of the problem with the Resident Evil movies, is that the series itself is a survival horror. It's not about going into bullet time and sliding under monsters and stuff. Sure, there's some quick time events here and there, but those movies were really more action films than they were survival horror. I'm not even sure how to necessarily make survival horror work in the context of a Resident Evil movie. There are movies that do it, that are a little bit more like the character has to avoid the monster and that sort of thing. Slasher films and that sort of stuff. It seems like you would want to make your Resident Evil more like that, or more like a traditional zombie movie. And while, yeah, you've got some guns, that stuff is really secondary to what is happening. And they don't seem to do that in the movies. So for whatever reason, they ended up where they're at. And then there's actually movies that aren't even video game movies, but may as well be. The Underworld series, for example. I mean, I bring that one up specifically because the last chapter of that came out the same year as the last episode of the Resident Evil film. And I mean, they could both be game movies. They both kind of were terrible and didn't get well received, and had a lot in common. It's a lot of the same kind of scenes. If you squint while watching, you could mistake them. They have so much in common. And then you move forward, you've got some more modern interpretations. You've got the new Resident Evil, Welcome to Raccoon City. While I also like that one, once again, it's just like they just didn't pay attention. They got so close to trying to make it like the game, but then just threw a whole bunch of stuff out the window. It's like, okay, why do you even try to make it close? Just totally make it your own, like they did with the first Resident Evil. Reboot it completely. But no, they couldn't quite get there. So they threw in just enough to make you feel like you're missing out on what you would really prefer, which is, an accurate representation of the game. And that just doesn't happen. So I am struggling to think beyond Tomb Raider of a video game movie that I thought was actually really good, besides just passable, because I think the Hitman movies are passable. They are reasonably good. They're entertaining. But there are far more movies that are just terrible, like Max Payne. I just tried to watch that the other day. Even the unrated version was difficult to get through. When they made it PG-13, it was quite clear they had no idea what the source material was about, because that is not a PG-13 story. So to try and cram it down into something that's palatable for people under the age of 18 was just absurd. I mean, that's not the audience. None of the people who played that game are necessarily that young. And if they were, then they can obviously handle a rated R version of the film. So just go ahead and do it. But anyway, I think that the biggest problem with making a video game into a movie is time. We always try to cram it into a 2-hour time frame when they should just turn it into a series, or maybe make it a trilogy of movies. Whatever they could do. I know that this stuff is just way too expensive these days, and oftentimes it's just they can't afford to take the gamble. Like, for example, they could make a movie with the intention of making 2 more. Then that first movie suffers a dramatic loss. It doesn't make any money back. So then they can't make the next 2 movies. But people are now exceptionally gun shy because there was a cliffhanger on that, and they don't want to try it again. And it becomes this sort of catch-22. But a series should not cost quite as much. and maybe afford them the time to really develop it out. Maybe give it a little bit more of a slow burn. It doesn't have to just start off and be absolutely insane. Let it build up the way that a game does. Games introduce you to something sometimes quickly, but then it slows back down, gives you a chance to take a breath, figure out what's going on, move through the story, experience it. They really need to do that with the adaptations that are live action as well. Allow those characters to breathe. One of the greatest things about the storytelling in a video game is that we have a lot of time to connect with the events, the world, and the characters. But in a 2-hour movie, that's much more difficult to do, especially with a video game that has to cram lore in your head and the story that's happening and make you care about the characters and show you Peril. All of those things need more time when you're working from this massive amount of material. So unless they figure out a way to carve out a smaller story and put that out, I think that video game movies are going to continue to suffer and fail. And the funny thing is that despite the better than average odds of them failing, they continue to do it. They continue to try. It's very interesting. It's just like they're like, I know this is going to work someday. But obviously it hasn't. But anyway, let me know what you think. Is there a video game movie that you love? Is there one that you hate? Do you have a list? Do you think they should keep going? Do you have an idea of how they could do a better job? Let me know in the comments. We'll talk about it. Anyway, that's it for Friday Ramble. This is Robert from Society Case Files, signing off.